Hey everyone, hope you had a very nice Christmas this year. Just got a new microphone, so audio quality will just be a lot better than before. Anyways, let's roll the intro. Keyframes are a new thing in the 2.2 update that allows you to make animations a lot easier than before, and has capabilities of moving, rotating, and scaling objects, and as well spawning different groups. So let's talk about them each in detail. So here are the two triggers that we're going to be talking about today. So let's start with the keyframe animation trigger. So this is a trigger that actually activates the animation itself, basically activating this trigger here. You can assign an animation group ID by basically having a group ID on the animation trigger itself. For example, I have it set to 1, and you can set it here to actually activate it. Target ID is basically the group ID of the target itself. For example, an object has the group ID of 1, and we can set it here. But you can also set the target ID in the keyframe trigger itself, which we're going to be talking about later. The parent ID is basically the parent itself from the whole group. So for example, I have many objects clustered together, and there are two ways to assign a group parent for an animation. So the first way is basically by selecting one object and pressing the P button. That makes it a group parent. Or the second way is basically assign another group ID for an object and then assign it here as the parent ID itself. In the next window, there are modifications. So you can basically modify values, for example, time modification, which basically makes everything a lot faster in an animation. Position X and position Y modifications basically modify the values of how much an object must move. Rotation modification basically modifies how much rotation there should be in an animation. And Scale X and Scale Y mod basically are just modifications for how much scaling should be done. It can also go into negatives for all of them as well. So it can be like in reverse. Now, let's move on to the main thing, which is the keyframe trigger. So this can be called just a keyframe. With this, you can copy, paste, and make a line of the animation itself. So we're making just multiple keyframes. This is going to be the start, this is going to be the end, where the line actually ends. You can also modify them by rotating them or also scaling them, and the same effect will apply to the objects in the animation. For example, it starts off normal, but when it reaches the keyframe here, it's going to rotate in that direction and also scale up the same amount as the keyframe itself. Cool, right? Now, let's go inside of it and see what we can actually do here. So, there are many things here, but I'll walk you through. Don't worry, everything will be alright. On the top, there's group ID, which is basically the same thing in the keyframe, the target ID. So you can either set the target ID here or the target ID over here, but make sure not to set on both of them, because I think it will break the animation itself. You can change duration from one keyframe to another. For this instance, the duration from this starting point to this keyframe itself. So you can change the time here. You can also set an easing style for it. No need to explain. Then this is basically rotation all the way around. It does a 360. And here, these two checkboxes basically say in which direction should the 360 actually rotate. On default, it is probably clockwise, and this one is basically counterclockwise, so you can set it here to do a 360 in the other direction. But if you want to be sure that it actually rotates counterclockwise, then you can check this box here. Spawn group ID is basically the group ID of a spawn trigger. So yeah, it basically activates a spawn trigger. So for example, I can get a spawn trigger and just set it to just spawn. Then I can assign a group ID for it and then set it here, and it will work just like that. You don't need another spawn trigger to spawn this. And you can also set a spawn delay. The proximity checkbox basically creates like a proximity circle or area when an object goes inside of it, then it will activate there instead of the object actually being on the keyframe itself. You can change the line opacity to see how much you want the lines to be visible. So for example here, I can set it to like 0.17 and it will be this much. Now, there are 4 different checkboxes down here. Closed loop, it basically has to be done here at the end of the animation. So if you assign closed loop, and as you can see, it will create another line which will make the object go back to the start. But if you don't have it, then it will just end here where the keyframe actually ends. Preview art basically makes the keyframe invisible completely, so you can see how actually the objects move without these being visible whatsoever. Reference only basically makes it just like a point where the object should go, but it doesn't affect the time, it doesn't affect the distance, it just goes straight through it. But to actually make it work, it is a little bit of a different story. So that's why we have 3 different checkboxes here. So currently on default, it is on time, which basically corresponds to the duration of these keyframes, like added together. But if you want the object to go through the reference only keyframes, then you have to either assign to even or distance. Even means that time between each keyframe is the duration instead of distance, which is the opposite for the distance. So it is the time between each keyframe by distance. So I'll show you the difference here in this example. So as you can see, there's like a little difference here. They both end up in the same spot at the same time, just that one will be a little behind than the other one. At the top, it is actually the even, but at the bottom, it is distance. There's also 4 plus buttons on the left side. So there's select all, which basically means you select all of the keyframe triggers. Then update art is not much of a big issue. It basically updates the preview art. So when you have this preview art here, then you can basically just update it. But I don't think it really actually does anything much, to be honest. Then you can also duplicate the animation by making another animation. And then we can also reverse order, which I will show you. Okay, so here's the normal animation, and the object will actually go like this, right? But reverse order basically reverses everything. So instead of going here, it goes in the opposite direction. And lastly, there's this. This is where you actually can make animations a lot smoother, more fluid. So, for example, let's add the curve here, and then when we copy, as you can see, it creates a curve. So when we copy normally, it basically creates a linear line. But when we use curve and copy, then we can make a curve. So if you just have one, it will create a line. So it needs like a reference to the endpoint, somewhere like this. So this is the end of the video, an explanatory video about the new keyframe triggers. I know some of the information might be still confusing, for example what even and distance checkbox does, so I will leave the editor guide in the description so you can actually check out what they actually do. But anyways, make sure to give a like and also subscribe for more tutorials like these. Goodbye. Hey, I was like testing my microphone and everything, and I found out that you can actually do this when you hit the microphone like this. You can basically make a bass boosted sound. Anyways, that's all there is to it.